Today, the state Senate unanimously passed bills that would increase the penalties for human trafficking in Michigan. Right now, trafficking is a 10-year felony. These bills would double that to 20 years with the possibility of life in prison if the victim is a minor. Now, one of the bills would also reduce the potential criminal liability for people caught up in sex trafficking. It would make sure minors cannot be charged with facilitating prostitution, and first-time offenders could be sentenced to probation. Republican John DeMoose says he and other lawmakers worked with Attorney General Dana Nessel's office to create laws that would be more effective at discouraging human trafficking, which he calls, quote, the worst form of evil.